Greenland crisis shocks Europe. Denmark prepared for war over Greenland after Trump's hardware threat. In early 2026, Donald Trump's repeated threats to take control of Greenland, the hard way, triggered one of the most serious geopolitical crises in recent history, pushing Denmark and its Europe allies to quietly prepare for a potential military conflict with the United States. Now it's time to dig deeper and understand the full story through this AI podcast.
Imagine standing on a freezing runway in the high Arctic. It's early 2026.
Right.
The wind chill is well below zero, and you are a military engineer. Your current orders are to, wire this multi-million-dollar piece of critical national infrastructure with explosives.
High-grade explosives.
Exactly. But here is the catch. You aren't doing this to defend against a traditional adversary like Russia or a rising power like China. You are actively preparing to blow up your own airports, your own capitals, runways, to deter an invasion from your nation's most powerful historical ally, the United States.
It is a profoundly jarring image, and it completely shatters the baseline assumptions we all have about, modern Western alliances.
Totally.
You simply do not expect to see a scenario where closely tied, long-standing democracies are quietly, desperately preparing for actual kinetic combat with one another.
Right, like real combat.
Exactly. And by kinetic, we mean a real shooting war. Bullets flying, bombs dropping, infrastructure burning.
It sounds like the plot of a geopolitical thriller you'd watch on an airplane, honestly. But according to a massive stack of reports, primarily sourced from the Danish broadcaster DR and extensive international intelligence coverage, this was the terrifying reality just a short time ago.
Yeah, it really was.
So the mission for today's deep dive is to look at these sources and unpack this unprecedented geopolitical crisis over Greenland. We are going to explore how close the world came to a massive fracture in Western alliances, the extreme, highly classified military strategies that were drawn up in the dark, and how global tensions triggered a stunning standoff in the ice. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to really understand how we got to the point of Danish engineers wiring their own runways with explosives, we have to recognize that geopolitical crises rarely happen in a vacuum.
Right, they don't just pop up out of nowhere.
No, not at all. The groundwork for the Greenland standoff was actually laid thousands of miles away from the Arctic Circle, specifically following a controversial U.S. military action in Venezuela.
Hold on, I need to stop you right there because I'm struggling to connect those dots.
Sure.
Venezuela is a tropical nation in South America. Greenland is an ice sheet at the top of the world. Why would the Danish military look at a conflict in South America and suddenly start, I don't know, loading explosives onto transport planes headed for the Arctic? Like, wait, so the tension didn't even start in the Arctic. It's like watching a neighborhood dispute on one street cause people 3 blocks over to start boarding up their windows.
That is a great analogy. And what's fascinating here is how that perfectly illustrates the deeply interconnected nature of modern geopolitical anxiety.
Interconnected how?
Well, in international relations, distance matters far less than behavior. When a major global power takes sudden, controversial military action in one part of the world, like the U.S. did in Venezuela, it shatters the assumption of predictability everywhere else.
Ah, I see.
For European nations, the action in Venezuela demonstrated a sudden American willingness to act unilaterally and aggressively to secure its interests, bypassing the usual diplomatic channels.
So it wasn't about Venezuela itself, it was about the precedent. It was Europe realizing that the old rules of engagement had just been thrown out the window.
Precisely. The psychological landscape in European defense ministries was already on extremely high alert. They were watching a U.S. administration that was proving it wouldn't hesitate to use force if it felt its strategic needs weren't being met.
And into that highly charged, kind of paranoid atmosphere drops the actual spark. Because in early 2026, Donald Trump began issuing repeated demands to take control of Greenland.
Right.
And the phrase that really set the alarms off across Europe was his public statement that if a deal couldn't be reached, he would do it, quote, the hard way.
Which is an intense thing to say when a world leader who has just demonstrated a willingness to use kinetic military force in South America starts talking about taking European-administered territory the hard way. Foreign intelligence agencies don't treat that as just political theater.
They can't afford to, right?
Exactly. Or even just a tough negotiating tactic. They are professionally obligated to treat it as a literal statement of intent.
But if you're listening to this and wondering why Greenland, we have to look at the map. I mean, we know it's massive. We know it's mostly covered in ice. But the U.S. rationale, according to the sources, was entirely strategic.
Very strategic.
The U.S. was voicing serious, urgent concerns about the growing presence of Russia and China in the Arctic region.
Because Greenland is arguably one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate on the planet if you're looking at the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
It sits right at the gateway between the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic, the famous GIUK gap.
The GIUK gap, yeah.
If you're the United States and you see Russia heavily militarizing its Arctic coastline with new icebreakers and missile bases.
And China declaring itself a near-Arctic state to push for influence.
Exactly. Controlling Greenland is about controlling the security umbrella of the entire North American continent. If an adversary gets a foothold in Greenland, the U.S. homeland is directly threatened.
So the strategic logic from the U.S. perspective was about locking down a highly vulnerable flank before someone else did.
That's the core of it.
But Denmark, which administers Greenland, wasn't having it. There was a direct quote from a Danish source speaking to DR that reads, "When Trump keeps saying he wants to take over Greenland, we had to take all scenarios seriously."
Yeah.
And taking it seriously meant moving from angry diplomatic protests in Copenhagen to actual physical preparation for war in the Arctic.
And this is the pivot point where the story goes from a tense diplomatic standoff to a true military crisis. Denmark mobilized.
According to the revelations from DR, Denmark took extraordinary, highly classified defensive measures. We are talking about military aircraft secretly transporting massive logistical hauls to Greenland.
Massive hauls. And it wasn't just troops and rations.
No, they were flying in heavy ammunition, explosives, and this is the detail that stopped me in my tracks: blood supplies.
Yeah, the blood supplies. The inclusion of blood supplies is the detail that should make everyone, from the casual observer to the seasoned defense analyst, just pause and take a breath.
Why is that specifically so alarming?
Well, military exercises happen all the time. But you do not establish complex, refrigerated supply chains to move human blood thousands of miles to the Arctic just for a drill.
Because blood has a strict shelf life, right?
Exactly. It requires constant temperature control. Moving it means your medical command is actively calculating acceptable casualty rates. Moving blood means you are expecting your soldiers to bleed.
Wow.
It is the absolute clearest indicator that a military is preparing for a real imminent conflict.
Which brings us to the actual defensive strategy. The reports detail a scorched earth plan.
Yeah, a very extreme plan.
Danish forces were reportedly ready to destroy their own key runways. Specifically, the runway in Nuuk, which is the capital of Greenland, and the runway in
Kangerlussuaq, yeah. That is the massive strategic air hub for the whole territory.
Right, so the objective was to physically prevent U.S. military aircraft from landing troops if an invasion occurred. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because on the surface, this sounds like a terrible plan. My first thought was, blowing up your own capital's runway seems like cutting off your nose to spite your face.
It really does.
It's the ultimate scorched earth tactic, literally cratering your own driveway so the moving van can't park.
Is this a standard defense playbook? Because it seems so desperate.
I mean, it is desperate, but it is standard when you are dealing with the terrifying reality of asymmetric defense.
Asymmetric meaning they are totally outmatched.
Exactly. Let's look at the actual mechanics of the balance of power here. Denmark possesses a highly capable, highly professional military.
No dope.
But mathematically, they are incredibly small compared to the overwhelming global projection capabilities of the United States Armed Forces. Denmark knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they could not win a head-to-head air or naval war against the U.S. Right, you can't just scramble a dozen jets and expect to shoot down an entire incoming fleet of American cargo planes and fighter escorts. It's a numbers game you lose in 5 minutes. Exactly. So if you can't shoot the planes down, what do? You deny those planes the one thing they absolutely require to execute a rapid, successful invasion.
An intact strip of concrete.
Yes. Heavy military transport aircraft, like a U.S. C-17 loaded with troops and armor, cannot land on a glacier. They cannot land on the tundra. By destroying Kangerlussuaq and Nuuk, Denmark would be denying the U.S. a quick, bloodless victory.
Because if you don't have the runway, how do you even get into Greenland?
You don't. At least not easily. Without those runways, Denmark forces the U.S. to either attempt incredibly dangerous, highly complex paratrooper drops into the freezing Arctic environment,
which sounds terrifying,
or mount a slow, heavily contested amphibious landing on a hostile rocky coast. The doctrine is called denial of access. You make the environment itself the primary weapon against the invader. The psychological weight of actually executing that order must have been crushing for the Danish command. I mean, one Danish official was quoted in the reports as saying, "We have not been in such a situation since April 1940.
That specific date carries an immense dark weight in Danish history.
That's World War II, right?
Yes, April 1940 is when Nazi Germany invaded Denmark.
Wow.
For a modern Danish defense official to compare a standoff with the United States, their primary NATO ally, the superpower that essentially anchors their modern security, to compare that to the absolute darkest trauma of their 20th century history. It tells you everything you need to know about the sheer panic inside the war rooms in Copenhagen.
But here is the logical flaw in the scorched earth strategy, and I imagine the Danish generals knew this too. Cratering your own driveway, destroying your own runways, it only buys you time.
Oh, absolutely.
If the United States is genuinely determined to take Greenland, they have the Army Corps of Engineers. They could parachute in equipment, secure the area, and rebuild a runway in a matter of weeks.
Sure they can.
Denmark had to know that blowing up concrete wouldn't hold off a determined superpower indefinitely.
They knew it perfectly well. A destroyed runway is a temporary roadblock to a military that spends nearly $1 trillion a year. Denmark needed a deterrent that the United States could not simply engineer its way around.
Right.
They needed to change the entire geopolitical math of an invasion.
And this leads to their actual strategic masterstroke.
Yeah.
Denmark rapidly reaches out to its closest European allies. We're talking France, Germany, Norway, and Sweden.
The heavy hitters in Europe, yeah.
They initiate a massive maneuver that becomes known as Operation Arctic Endurance. Now, publicly, this was framed and announced to the press as a standard, scheduled military exercise in the high north.
Just a routine drill, supposedly.
Exactly. But internally, the leaked reports show it was executed as a strict, hardline deterrence operation. Multinational European troops arrived in Greenland, and fighter jets and major military assets from across Europe were quickly moved north to the ice.
And this is the critical turning point of the entire crisis. Denmark recognized the reality of asymmetric warfare. Their own military couldn't defeat the U.S. militarily, so the entire strategy shifted from physically defeating an invasion to
just making it incredibly expensive.
Exactly, to mathematically increasing the cost of an invasion so high that Washington would be forced to abandon the idea entirely.
But how does moving a few French jets or a contingent of German soldiers actually stop the U.S. military? I mean, is it essentially a geopolitical human shield? They brought in their friends, so the aggressor would have to fight the whole group.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture of strategic doctrine, what Denmark implemented is a classic tripwire deterrence strategy. It's brilliant in its calculated simplicity, but you have to understand the mechanics of how it changes the cost of war.
Walk me through it.
A tripwire force isn't designed to win a battle. Its sheer presence removes the ambiguity of an isolated conflict. By placing multinational European troops directly in the path of a potential U.S. advance, Denmark ensured that any American attack on Greenland wouldn't just be a localized scuffle with Danish forces.
Because if an American bomber drops a payload on the runway at Kangerlussuaq, they aren't just hitting Danish concrete.
No.
They might kill a French pilot stationed there, or a German engineer, or a Swedish infantryman.
Precisely. And the moment an American bomb kills a French or German soldier, the United States is no longer just fighting Denmark. They have just committed an act of war against France and Germany.
Wow, yeah.
The tripwire ensures that the moment the first shot is fired, it triggers a chain reaction often tied to mutual defense clauses within the EU. The conflict instantly, automatically becomes a wider war with the entirety of Europe.
It forces the U.S. to take a clearly hostile, deadly step against multiple trusted, powerful allies simultaneously.
Exactly. The strategy wasn't to build an army big enough to beat America on the ice. The strategy was to make the diplomatic, political, and economic price of pulling the trigger absolutely catastrophic for Washington.
And so we reach the ultimate collision point. You have the U.S. administration eyeing the undeniable strategic necessity of the Arctic, throwing around rhetoric about taking it the hard way.
Right.
And you have Europe establishing an immovable multinational tripwire in the ice, while Danish engineers stand ready to blow their own infrastructure to dust. The diplomatic fallout from this collision, according to the sources, was immense.
The clash was incredibly sharp and highly public. Trump openly accused the European nations of playing a dangerous game by deploying those forces under the guise of an exercise.
And from his perspective, they were. They were actively, physically blocking a U.S. strategic initiative in America's own backyard.
Yeah, but the European leaders didn't blink. The reports show that Europe actually tightened its coordination in response to the accusations from Washington. They held the line on Operation Arctic Endurance.
They didn't pull the French jets back. They didn't recall the German troops.
Which is a profound testament to how seriously they viewed the threat of American unilateralism. They believed the threat was real enough to risk a rupture with the U.S.
And ultimately, the tripwire held.
It did. The presence of those allied forces changed the math just enough. Eventually, the situation did cool down. Trump stepped back from the immediate, explicit threat of military action.
Right. The public rhetoric shifted away from taking the territory the hard way and slowly moved toward negotiations and diplomatic discussions regarding the future security status of Greenland.
Thank goodness.
Open conflict was avoided. The explosives wired onto the runways in Nuuk and Kangerlussuaq weren't detonated. The refrigerated blood supplies flown up from Copenhagen hopefully went unused and expired quietly in a warehouse somewhere.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? When you read through these comprehensive reports from DR and the international press, what really sticks with you is the haunting realization that even though the guns never fired, the foundation of the global alliance seems fundamentally altered.
This raises an important question. How do you ever go back to normal? You cannot just unring a bell of that magnitude.
You really can't.
The Greenland crisis proved to the entire world how incredibly fragile seemingly ironclad alliances are when core strategic interests suddenly collide. Europe is left with lasting, profound concerns about its own security architecture.
The comforting illusion of permanent, unquestionable safety among Western allies has been completely shattered.
It makes complete sense. If you have sat in a classified war room staring at a map and seriously calculated the logistics and acceptable casualty rates of fighting your best friend, that changes the friendship forever. You never look at that ally the same way again. The baseline of trust is permanently replaced by a lingering, quiet suspicion. You always know what they are capable of.
And looking forward, this episode permanently shifts the balance of power and the operational reality in the Arctic.
Yeah.
Well, everyone now knows exactly what everyone else is willing to do to control the high north. Denmark proved they would literally burn their own house down and destroy their own capital's infrastructure to protect it.
And Europe proved they would risk a catastrophic, historic rupture with America to hold a line in the ice.
Exactly. The Arctic is no longer just a frozen, ignored frontier. It is an active, deeply contested geopolitical chessboard where the old rules of alliance simply do not apply anymore. It is a new era of vulnerable multipolarity.
It really is.
Which brings us back to you, listening to this deep dive right now. This whole terrifying crisis over Greenland isn't just some quirky, localized historical footnote about ice, radars, and runways.
No, not at all.
It is a masterclass in how rapidly the rules of global security can be rewritten overnight. We all operate under the comforting assumption that the way the world worked yesterday is the way it will work tomorrow.
But this crisis proves that for anyone who wants to stay genuinely well-informed, assuming the status quo will last is the biggest risk of all.
It forces a complete recalculation of global security paradigms. If the U.S. can threaten Denmark, no alliance is sacred.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own as you go about your day.
Okay.
If the mere threat of taking territory the hard way forced closely tied historic allies to quietly plan to destroy their own vital infrastructure and deploy human shields just to stop the United States supply on.
Wow.
How might smaller nations around the world fundamentally rewrite their own survival and defense strategies going forward, knowing that the cruelly unthinkable is now fully on the table? Next time you're sitting on a commercial flight, looking out the window as you touch down on a long concrete runway, just imagine the wires running beneath it, waiting for the signal.
Okay, one question for you. Could Denmark's extreme preparations, including plans to destroy its own runways, signal how seriously Europe viewed Trump's Greenland threat and the possibility of US-led invasion? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.